What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thank you so much for checking into my YouTube channel. The other day, you might have noticed this, I put up a little poll, a little Google form thing to try to get some information back from my viewers, and thank you for filling that out if you did so. I also put at the bottom of that poll an opportunity to ask me some kind of question, and so I threw that out there, and by far the most common question that was asked in that Google poll was one that comes in quite frequently from time to time, so I thought I'd take a moment to answer that question today. And the question is simply, what is my view on the end times? And for some time I've kind of delayed answering that question, probably for a number of reasons. Maybe one of those reasons is my own feelings of inadequacy in the area of eschatology. It's certainly not one of my areas of expertise. For instance, I've never preached through the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel. And so maybe there's been some hesitancy on my part to talk about my view on the end times, although I'm certainly not embarrassed of it. So having said that, I would be considered either an optimistic amillennialist, which is to say an amillennialist that has a very positive view of the outcome of all things, or you might categorize me as a pessimistic postmillennialist. So either one of those two views would probably define me. I usually consider myself an amillennialist, which basically means that when it comes to my interpretation of Revelation 20 on the millennium, that I largely see that as referring to the whole of the church age, and not that there is some particular 1,000-year period of time that we need to plug in either before or after Christ comes back, as the various other end time schemes go. I suppose I could be considered a positive amillennialist because I really have a very, very hopeful, optimistic view of the evangelization of the whole world. And I take that from several places of the New Testament, but specifically the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about the success of the gospel mission before he returns. So in that sense, I am an optimistic amillennialist because I think that global evangelism will be largely, if not completely, successful. Now, that does not mean that every individual is going to be converted. Far from it. What that does mean is that the gospel will thoroughly saturate every nation and every people and every tribe to the extent that we can say that the leaven has thoroughly worked through the entire batch of dough. So in that sense, I'm an optimistic amillennialist. I would not be, however, a full postmillennialist because I'm a little bit more skeptical about the conversion of the nation states themselves as such. So whereas I would see the evangelization of the world being successful in reaching into every tribe and nation and tongue, where there would be a vibrant local church in every culture saturated throughout the world, I'm not convinced that the nation states themselves will be Christianized. And so that's why I would hesitate to define myself as a full postmillennialist. Because if you're going to go full bore postmillennial, usually you have to have a very optimistic outcome in terms of the nation states themselves becoming essentially parts of Christendom or Christianized governments. That I'm not so sure about because I see in the scriptures a lot of persecution of the church towards the latter days. One thing we can clarify that I am certainly not would be a dispensationalist. I'm definitely not a dispensationalist. I'm not a premillennialist. And, those views are largely very popular today, although we should admit that they haven't been popular throughout all of church history, and that those are kind of Johnny-come-latelys on the theological scene. One of the reasons I'm skeptical about dispensationalism and premillennialism, except for classic premillennialism, is that they're kind of theological novelties. So put me in the camp of the historic Protestant Reformed views of either a pessimistic postmillennial or an optimistic amillennialist, one of those two. If you're still wondering about that, just go ahead and look it up in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Look on the final sections on the return of Christ and the final state of man, and that's where I am because in all things I try to maintain myself as a confessional Reformed Christian, well within the main track of what Christians have always believed about the return of the King. So let me mention a couple of particulars. My view, the amillennial view, is probably the simplest view, which is why I never preach with a big end times chart behind me. You've probably seen people do that on television. I really resist what I would call newspaper theology, which is the attempt to interpret our Bibles based on what we find in the newspaper rather than the other way around. I'm definitely not into that. And so I almost never try to pin some kind of event like the Gulf War or the collapse of the USSR or the rise of China's economy. I never try to pin those things to a particular biblical text. I'm just wary of that. So my end times view is actually really, really simple. It goes something like this. Jesus rose from the dead, right? So that is the beginning of the end times. How do I know that? Because well, the book of Hebrews starts off like that these are essentially the last times or the last days. So you can say confidently we are living in the last times, but that goes all the way back to the resurrection, probably to Pentecost as well. From there on until Jesus comes back again, we're living in what is called the church age. And so as a good amillennialist, I would say that the millennium spoken of in Revelation 20 pertains to that entire age of the church. And so Satan has been bound with respect to his ability to deceive the nations. Not that he, the foul demon, has been thrown into a pit for a period of time, but rather that his ability to deceive is limited with that respect, that he can no longer keep the nations in darkness. So as for the tribulation, I think the whole church age is really a state of a great tribulation, and I think we can read the Olivet Discourse in that sense. Although I don't rule out that there would be the possibility, even the likelihood, of severe trial and difficulty during the very last run-up to the return of Christ. So again, gospel success, a personal antichrist, although remember there have been many antichrists, plural, throughout that entire church age, but probably one great deceiver towards the end. And then, and this would set me apart from a lot of dispensationalists that I'm about to say next, we see one return of Christ, not a secret rapture and then a later return of Christ separated perhaps by 7 years or 3.5 years. That would be more premillennial constructs. But a good amillennialist or a good postmillennialist has one great return of Jesus Christ, not a secret rapture separated from a visible return, but one great return of Christ, his second coming, which is the eschatological event that the whole of the New Testament looks forward to. We call it sometimes in Scripture the epiphany of Christ, the revealing of Christ, or the parousia of Christ. And it's especially that word parousia that I think is important and rules out any kind of secret rapture view, because the word parousia, or the return or the coming of Christ, as Paul uses that term so often, the word parousia is a huge visible return of a conquering king after having defeated an enemy army. And so as he comes back into his home nation or his home city, the parousia would be this massive parade, this public spectacle. And so I don't see any reason why that could possibly be a hidden or secret rapture of Christ. And so the return of Christ and the catching up of the saints, otherwise called the rapture, are essentially coextensive. They are, in fact, the same event. So to sum up my view, I would say, number one, avoid newspaper theology. I'm really not into trying to connect current events with some particular passage in Daniel or Ezekiel or the book of Revelation. There are other people that's their specialty, that's their thing. It's just not my interest or my skill set. I don't even think that that's necessarily a healthy thing to do. The other thing I would try to do, this would be number two then, is to try to avoid a strong dichotomy between a preterist and futurist views. Let me quickly explain. A preterist is somebody who sees almost everything in Scripture as pertaining to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. A full preterist might not even have a return of Christ in their view, which in my view, if you're there, that's heterodox. That's outside the pale of Orthodox Christianity. So I avoid a strong preterism, but I also avoid a strong futurism. And a futurist would be one who sees everything in Revelation as pertaining to the future. And I think that's wrong and misguided as well, because there are a lot of things in the book of Revelation that I think are either descriptive of the gospel typologically or the whole church age representatively, and yes, some things that are futuristic as well. So I try to avoid a strong preterist futurist dichotomy. and I think that probably gives us a safer interpretation of texts like the Olivet Discourse. Okay, a couple of recommendations and then I'm out for the day. First recommendation, if you have the basic ESV study Bible, and I know many of you do, if you're wondering more about the view of amillennialism, if you haven't heard about it before, it's on page 2460, and of course it has the simplest chart because I told you it's the simplest, most basic outline sketch or view of the end times. But that would probably sum me up the best, those two views on page 2460. I'm probably mostly an amillennialist. A couple of books that I can recommend about this topic. One is called Kingdom Come, the Amillennial Alternative by Sam Storms, who is a Reformed Baptist, as I understand his persuasion. And then maybe a little bit closer to my Reformed camp would be A Case for Amillennialism by Kim Riddlebarger, subtitled Understanding the End Times. And I'll post some links directly to Amazon in the description of this video so you can toggle down and get those directly if you're interested. Well, I hope that answers your question. Chances are it actually prompted more questions. And anyways, it's the best I can do for today. So thanks for checking in. I do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.